Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Today, I have Sam Hembree on the show. Sam is the content marketing specialist and all-around podcast pro at Outreach. Sam currently runs Outreach's 3 podcasts: the Sales Hacker Podcast, Revenue Innovators, and the Sales Engagement Podcast. Running one podcast is hard, and Sam is running 3 in addition to the other work she does, working in video, marketing, and social media at Outreach. We're going to talk about how she balances it all and what it takes to run not 1, but 3 podcasts. Enjoy the show. So I think a common misconception about podcasting is that it's this audio channel and that you get it live on Apple Podcasts and your B2B podcast works its magic. Something that I see a lot of is that these companies set out to do a podcast and all of a sudden realize the amount of work that comes with not only producing a podcast, which that a lot of times is the hardest part, is getting it actually executed and recorded and cut, but then promoting it and getting it seen with repurposed content. And I think the difficulty is that most marketers know that they need a podcast for their business, but not many know or have ever know how to execute it or how to actually do it. So I'm curious, what do you think of the fact that marketers know they need a podcast, but they struggle to execute one?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. As I'm, looking at podcasts on Apple Podcasts app, a lot of them don't have a ton of ratings and reviews. So I had a sense as I was jumping into launching a podcast that there's probably not a lot of strategy that goes into making sure that those really important pieces are there. But I would say the content falls flat a lot of times too over time when you put it on autopilot. So I definitely think a lot of people don't realize what it takes with repurposing content, like you said, promotion. There's a lot of enablement material to make for your hosts so that they're successful and to make sure that your guests have the best experience possible. So I think it's definitely easy to put podcasts on autopilot. But then you've got to have somebody that's making sure the guests are fully prepped and following up with guests when it goes live, giving them promotion materials, sending them swag, making them happy, rallying a huge promotion effort around each episode, and then making those specific asks for ratings and reviews. So I think if you have a podcast on autopilot, you're not going to get the results that you want. I think you definitely have to have somebody with their eyes on the show who's digging into analytics on a regular basis to know what's working, what's not, where to make improvements. Otherwise, I think your show is going to get stale if you don't have somebody, giving it the time of day.
So you run 3 podcasts right now. How do you balance that?
The first thing I would say is absolutely, we have incredible hosts, and I think that makes a big difference right up front. So I would say that's probably the most important piece if you haven't launched your podcast yet, is to be really thoughtful about who hosts your show. Somebody who's a subject matter expert, who builds rapport really well, really naturally, who asks thoughtful questions. I think if you have thoughtful, interesting hosts who know their stuff, everything else falls into place much more simply. And then, for us, like you said, we have 3 podcasts. So having an agency does definitely help, like coordinating with audio editors, writing your descriptions, uploading to streaming platforms. I mean, like when you have to upload to a bajillion streaming platforms, I can't imagine doing that manually. So that's really huge to have a lot of the more manual tasks of every single episode offloaded. But past that, I think there are a lot of things that a marketing team or a producer like myself can do to enable the host for success. Subject matter experts, leaders, they're really busy. And so we can take the scheduling, the prep work, all of those more mundane tasks off of their plate. So that's kind of my job. I would say what that's looked like is having a process documented and very easily accessible. So for the Sales Engagement Podcast, for instance, we have a how-to guide. We use Riverside as our video platform. We have interview tips and letting the host know how they can let the guest know that the episode is live, having like a template for them to use, and then making analytics and reporting accessible. So just having it like all in one place, documented, where hosts can access that easily. So because that process exists for the Sales Engagement Podcast, it starts to run itself in some ways, like some of these pieces for this podcast in particular, like each host is reaching out to a guest that I'll pair them with, or they source the guest themselves and they conduct the prep call and the interview, and then we take over when it's time for production and promotion. But for each podcast and for each host, the needs are definitely different. For Revenue Innovators, it's newer. We have less documentation. I get on the interviews myself, like just to help record on the back end, rally everyone for promotion. For the Sales Hacker Podcast, we have sponsors. So I communicate with sponsors, help get the copy for the host to read. Also like make promo videos for every episode, let the guests know when it goes live, ask them to share. So what I guess I'm saying here is like each podcast has definitely its own set of needs depending on the host and which pieces we have with our agency and which pieces we don't. For Revenue Innovators, they make us, one video clip for each episode, but then for our other shows we don't have that, so I make those. So there's definitely different pieces, and then of course having somebody who's focusing on it, you can fit in those more miscellaneous pieces like setting up a landing page or making improvements to the landing page, writing ad spots for the front of your podcast. We can just easily, I can work with whoever wants to get an ad spot in there and write that up for them, or rewrite intros, outros, keep it fresh, make sure you always have fresh CTAs. I think these are things people probably don't update very frequently, but we're starting to just really try to keep it fresh, keep it updated. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, and I feel like what Outreach is doing around podcasts is very forward thinking. First off, I see it a lot where, a director of marketing is told we need a podcast, or maybe they know that they need a podcast, and they're expected to spend 5% of their time on podcasting. And you look at Outreach and what you're doing, and I'll use your words, which is somewhere around 50 to 60% of your job is working on the podcast. And I think that that's really a good understanding of what goes into executing on one. And then the second piece that I really like, which is forward thinking, I believe, is having multiple shows. A big thing that I preach and work with my clients on and just talk about on LinkedIn and social media is to have a very specific audience for a show and making sure that your show speaks directly to that audience. So if you look at Motion, we have 4 shows. We have a show that speaks directly to B2B marketers that are interested in podcasting, which is this show. Then we have a personal branding podcast run by Nick Bennett. We have a podcast about communities, which is run by Chantel Marcel. We have a podcast about how to use, which we do with Camille Trent. So we have these like different hosts, different audiences, and we don't put them all under one umbrella and say like, this is the marketing show that, you can tune in, and maybe one week we'll be talking about podcasting and the next week we'll be talking about organic content, but very specific shows for those specific audiences. What led Outreach to the idea that you should have different shows?
Yeah, well, for one, we didn't launch them all at the same time. They kind of came each one at a time for different reasons. So the Sales Hacker podcast, I believe, came first, and it was, really targeted to give salespeople practical, like tangible strategies that they can get better at their job today by hearing what we have. So it really just made sense with Sales Hackers' vision to have that kind of a podcast. And then sales engagement is more on the outreach side and was created as more of for a prospecting play, but having the ability to bring on prospects and showcase them to our audience, and then also like build the relationship at the same time. But it's focusing on all the different aspects of sales engagement. And so Revenue Innovators has, the newest show, and it's much different than the Sales Hacker podcast. We had talked about different options, as RevOps started growing the topic about maybe incorporating it as a segment of the Sales Hacker podcast. But like you said, it doesn't really make sense if your audience is used to one thing to just switch gears on them like that. So, and we knew we just needed something entirely different. And so Revenue Innovators is, geared toward enterprise VPs, which it's VPs and above. And this is really a little bit different than the Sales Hacker podcast. For RevOps leaders who are being really innovative. And we also wanted to get out of just the sales and just the tech industry. So we wanted to, our first guest has experience in the automotive industry, and our most recent guest is in the cannabis industry. So we really just wanted to shake things up with this podcast and reach a new audience like you're talking about, and start targeting this new concept of the revenue innovator, which is what outreach is trying to evangelize. So it definitely made sense to branch out and give this its own show.
Yeah, I love that. Just having different shows that execute on different things. And, on the Sales Engagement podcast, I love that too, because, what better way to show different ways you can do outreach, which is the business itself, than finding different ways to do it. Podcasting and doing outreach on behalf of podcasting, obviously, is a big play that a lot of companies are doing. I want to talk a little bit about how you're balancing all of this, and this will go back into kind of that first question that I have. But I think another big issue is the coordination behind podcasting, especially in the business setting with busy hosts and guests who have full-time jobs. Most of the time, they're not spending their time just being the host of a show. So you're running 3 shows with different hosts and different guests. How do you go about coordinating all of the moving parts of booking episodes?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been evolving as I've gotten more into coordinating for the Revenue Innovators podcast. So I'm definitely more into the scheduling and communicating with guests before each episode, which is something that I'm not as intimately connected with on the other 2 podcasts. So, it's really just a matter of having the time each day. And I know there's an argument about whether or not you should be in your inbox like first thing in the morning. You should be doing something creative, but I feel like it helps to get go through the emails in the morning and answer any questions that come up that way. It's just been really helpful to stay organized, like having everything in one place and one folder, like branding materials, messaging, one-pagers, analytics, tools, passwords. Like that way anybody can step in at any point and know what's happening and where to find it. And then having, that enablement material set up, having all of your processes documented helps a ton. I have a spreadsheet that I use with our agency that tracks every single person we reach out to. I feel like that has helped a ton because I can say, here's all of my guests. I have the date when they're, scheduled to record, and then the date when we have them going live, so that I can always make sure that our queue is full. So it's really cool with, Revenue Innovators. We're almost booked out through the end of the year. I think we practically are. So just having that transparency with the dates so that, the agency can see it and they can be like, hey, did that episode, you said you were recording on this day? And can be like, oh yeah, we recorded, or, oh, we moved it to this day. Just like keeping it, all together in a spreadsheet. We have all 3 shows. So I can just kind of see who's going live this week. We have 3 different guests, say, and just keeping it all in one place has been really helpful. And I'm still learning as I go with how to keep up with all of it. But I try to just, send over the 1-pager right away when they email, and kind of keep up with them and their questions up until they're on the show with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure many people who listen to this show can empathize, people who are, doing their best to keep one show going, and then 3 is kind of another level. One thing that I wanted to talk to you about the actual shows themselves, and that you mentioned to me, was that it was very important to you that the shows were interesting and not, and I'm using finger quotes here for anyone who's listening, not just another business podcast. What led to that aha moment that you didn't want to just create another business podcast?
Yeah. So, as I got into podcasts, I just started listening to as many as I could, even if it was just one episode from a particular show, because I wanted to see what are they doing. And so as you start listening, you start seeing similarities. And it also, the point of the exercise and just being aware of what's going on is to see where the opportunity is. Like, how do you stand out? There's tons of podcasts in every space. So how do you know, how do you not just do what everybody else is doing? That was already a question that we were kind of asking. So as I was looking through them, there were certain similarities. Like, a lot of shows have one host, and I don't think like that's a bad thing, but it's just something to observe. Like, a lot of times there's only one guest. Like, there was some more profound, like, little things that we noticed, but each podcast has these different, sometimes it's just like a back and forth interview, or sometimes they have like these segments that kind of stand out and you're like, what's that? What's happening here? It kind of like re-engages the listener. So we kind of went through that exercise just to see like, where's our opportunity here? And that I think that was really helpful. So that's why with Revenue Innovators, we just said that, we don't want to be just another business podcast. How do we differentiate? So one of the biggest things I think is just having a really incredible host. In our case, we're having 2. So we're trying to kind of build that chemistry between 2 hosts that can also talk between each other and disagree and pull the interviewee into the conversation with them. And we're still in the process of making some of the changes that we'd like to see. But I think changing up the format, adding segments was something, that we saw that we thought was interesting. So we're trying to add in some industry gossip, because when you have these industry leaders who are, know what's happening, it's really interesting to just kind of get their candid reactions to what's going on. So we're pulling that in more. We just kind of started on our last episode. We just released, we had our 4th guest on, I think. So we're still new to it. Yeah. And then just trying to like borrow from entertainment podcasts or podcasts in other industries. We've talked about like, what if we rung a bell every time somebody said a certain word? Just something that makes people go, oh, this is different. This is fun. Being silly, encouraging our hosts to be really natural, and putting people on the spot, even like to back up their claims with numbers, make people uncomfortable. I know it depends on like the topics that you're talking about, but
Yeah.
I think people really like listening to talk shows, or they feel like, you know, they're listening in on some kind of unscripted conversation that's happening between two industry leaders. And I know like that doesn't probably work for every kind of podcast, but for revenue innovators, that's what we saw as something that might change it up, make it different.
And I think that's the value of having more than one podcast, right? So like if you only have one podcast, I would assume most businesses want to have their one podcast be top of funnel type content that's usually interview based, that's going to give practical tips within your space, which it sounds like is pretty much the Sales Hacker podcast, right? Like that's there to help people get better at your job. But then when you have additional podcasts, you have the opportunity to branch out and do different things, right? So we have recorded content, which is this show, which is interview based. We try to make it interesting by tackling conflicts, right, that people see, because podcasting is hard. So this show generally revolves around what's difficult in B2B podcasting that people are running into and how are they overcoming it, right? So that's like what we're talking about in today's episode. Now, we're going to go and do other things in the future, but I will leave like some breadcrumbs of, we have grand plans to potentially do like some sort of breakdown show or teardown show where we're looking at podcasts and saying, hey, here's what someone did well and what someone didn't, maybe could improve on, or something along those lines. I wouldn't want that to be our only podcast. I wouldn't want that to be how like we're perceived from the outside as like, this is our one pillar podcast and that's how people know us. But when you do have additional podcasts, I think you have the flexibility to do some different things, which it sounds like is what you're doing with the Revenue Innovators podcast. Yeah,
I love that idea that you just threw out there. I think that'd be so cool, because you see email teardowns and tearing down, you know, like a social media LinkedIn profile or something. So yeah. I don't think I've ever seen that with podcasts. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, and again, you know, just going into the idea that I wouldn't want that to be our one show. Right? Mm-hmm. Like I like if we only had one show on our site, I don't want it to be a teardown show. Like, wow, these people really enjoy just like ripping other people's podcasts. But if it's like one thing out of many, you know, it would be our fifth podcast, let's say, you know, then it's like, okay, that's just like another cool thing that they wanted to bolt on.
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you're saying there. There's definitely the ability to build on top of what you have. Like
outreach, right? I don't know that Outreach would only want to have the Revenue Innovators podcast. They would, if we were starting from like square one today, Outreach has no podcasts. I would say the first podcast that you all would probably want to launch would be something similar to the Sales Hacker podcast.
Right, or the Sales Engagement podcast.
Exactly. That's much more like brand centric. And then when you have that, you have the ability to build into other types of shows, which I think for someone like yourself who's in this every day makes your job probably a little more fun to get to do a little bit different types of shows.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that the revenue innovators is, you know, what we are pushing towards in terms of, you know, the ICP that we're going for. So I feel like in that sense, it makes sense for Revenue Innovators to be like the main outreach show. But at the same time, you know, it is a very specific guest that we want to have on the show. And we want to be able to have lots of folks join us on the show. And so in that case, it's nice to have, you know, another podcast that serves a different audience where we can include those people. So that's where I definitely agree.
Yeah, I see that sometimes where people do, they use the podcast. I'm curious actually if this is something that you're doing with Revenue Innovators, is like they'll use or want to get a podcast out to almost inform the public that the way that we're perceived as a brand isn't the only thing that we do, right? And so I'm curious and I used to ask, let me give a little bit more background. So like I would ask new clients, what do people think that you do? And what do you think that you do? And a lot of times what do people think that we do? And that's what the public generally knows you as versus what do you think you do was different. And that's why they wanted to create a podcast, is they wanted the public to recognize that they do more than just what they've been known to do over 5 or 10 years. So I'm curious, are you using the Revenue Innovators podcast to almost inform the world that, hey, outreach is pushing into new segments that maybe you didn't know about?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is probably even a benefit more than I've realized. I mean, we launched quickly, and so, I think, yes, definitely. I mean, I love, Mary Shea, one of our hosts, she has, this new, we've come up with this new definition of what the revenue innovator is. So like a new cohort of revenue leaders who put buyers at the center of their strategies, who arm their sellers with the most innovative sales technologies, who over-index on data rather than intuition to inform their business decisions. And this has kind of just come about since the podcast, and I think it's going to be really huge for outreach going forward. And so this podcast is a way to start evangelizing this idea of the revenue innovator. So I think, yes, and probably even more than I know right now.
Yeah, and what better way to get out new ideology, methodology than to put out a podcast where you can actually have these conversations with people about what it is that you're looking to do. I mean, it's great if internally that's a plan, and then you're trying to put out some marketing materials, but then to be able to get people on to talk about how they're doing it, how they're executing on it, and really informing, hey, look, not only are we leading this charge, but we're thought leaders in it. We're talking to all of the people in different industries, not just the ones that you typically know us for. So I think that's super interesting, and I just love that you have different shows that speak to different audiences, and I just love people who are using podcasts the right way in B2B. And I want to talk about the ways that you are using it, using them, I should say, and talk about the output. What type of repurposed content are you putting out to get your shows noticed?
Yes. Repurposing is something I love because I've started out being a social media marketer first. That was my thing, was repurposing content. But yeah, I mean, I think great content, like it speaks for itself, but you have to obviously like push it out there. So I think, it's most compelling when you aren't just asking people to do something, but actually like taking time to pick out the best advice from the show and then giving it away freely, whether that's like micro videos, which we do. So even if they don't go listen right now, they've benefited from the show. And so I think like if that little nugget that you pull out has resonated with them, they're more likely to recall it later when somebody is like, hey, I want to learn more about the challenges revenue operations leaders are facing. So I think they're going to be more likely to recommend the show, and if they, run into a similar situation. So as far as, for Revenue Innovators, we've got one social clip included per episode in our contract with the agency. But for the other shows, I personally go and grab what I think is the most interesting clip from the conversations. And then we share it. I spend the morning that the episode goes live just sharing it with everyone, asking the host to share, the guests. We reach out to influencers who are particularly interested in whatever topic we're talking about and ask them to share it. We'll share it on all of our own platforms, on Outreach's platforms, and we share it in our newsletter. So we just try to utilize every single channel that we have to push out the episodes, and we have more ideas for what we're not using YouTube Shorts. I just realized this recently. There's so many. We put it out on YouTube, Instagram stories, IGTV. I think there's just I have a long, nice promotion list, and we try to go down it.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
And so then I'm curious. So you're doing all of this promotion, right? And you're repurposing these assets and pushing them out everywhere. So what KPIs do you track around your show?
Yeah. So I feel like there's, two different parts. Kind of one is how we decided what goals we wanted to hit when we launched. And then now that we kind of have like a 1 month baseline, that's how it's influenced how we're looking at the rest of the year. So I could kind of like go into both of those if you're wanting.
Absolutely. You can start with what you started with and what your plans are now.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. And it's super hard, I feel like, because I was just thinking, if you haven't launched a show before, how would you know? Like, how do you know what to expect? That was kind of an interesting question. But so before, launching Revenue Innovators, we had 2 other podcasts. So I was able to dig and find like a 30-day report, first 30-day report from the Sales Engagement podcast. So I kind of treated that like a baseline for what to expect. And then once we crossed 30 days with Revenue Innovators, we set some ambitious goals from there for where we wanted to grow the rest of the year. But the Sales Engagement podcast launched 12 episodes in their first 30 days, and they got about 2,600 downloads. Their average per episode was about 220, and this was just, in their first 30 days. So I'm thinking, let's double this for Revenue Innovators. Then I looked around at other podcasts in the space to see how many ratings and reviews they were getting, it's hard to gauge that, I feel like, but we really wanted to shoot for the stars. So we were like, let's get 100 ratings and 50 reviews, just because it seemed like that was a big number compared to what I was seeing. So in our first month, we launched 5 episodes. And we got about 2,200 downloads. So we were averaging about 440 downloads per episode. So, and then for ratings and reviews, we got to 57 ratings and 18 reviews. So we were excited about that. Yeah.
I want to point out one thing just for the audience, because downloads are so, as you said, when people don't know what to look at, they don't know what they're looking at. So one of the things that we find is that the amount of downloads that an episode should get and the amount of downloads that a marketer or a board think that a podcast download should get are very different things. And I actually just wrote about this on LinkedIn today. So getting 400 downloads within the first 7 days of a podcast being published would put you somewhere around the top 7% of all podcasts in the world. That's just something that people don't recognize. Like, you look on, let's use LinkedIn, for example, and you put out a LinkedIn post and it gets like 250 likes and it's about the podcast, and people are like, oh sweet, so 250 likes on LinkedIn, so I should be looking at 200 plus downloads. And it does not equate that way so directly. You're requiring so much more time from people. So 400 downloads per episode, and I'm using Buzzsprout, which is a hosting platform that has 103,000 active podcasts. 400 downloads in Buzzsprout would put you in the top 7% of all podcasts globally.
That is so cool to hear, because even though I thought I had somewhat of a baseline, it's hard to know what success looks like for a podcast. So that's really exciting. That was actually a question that I wanted to ask you, was you have a lot of these conversations, you work with podcasters. So just to know where that stacks up, that's pretty cool.
It's just, people use arbitrary numbers to determine what a podcast should do, how it should perform. You have people who sit on boards, of these technology companies who have never launched a podcast in their lives, and they're like, yeah, I would expect that, on a monthly basis, we should be looking at 10,000 downloads. I'm like, where is this number coming from? I mean, literally the top 1% of podcasts is 4,000 downloads within the first 7 days of publishing an episode. So you're talking about doubling top 1%. When you don't have the statistics to look at, numbers just get fabricated. So yeah, I mean, that's a phenomenal launch in your first 30 days, getting 400 downloads per episode. I mean, you came out of the gates in the top 10%.
That's incredible.
The hard part is sustaining it, and that's where you see, lots of podcasts. They'll come out of the gate strong and then fall off, which I think is the nice part of being someone in your role who or is smart by outreach, is to have someone in your role focused on the podcast, having an agency in place, and making sure that pod fade, which is the act of a podcast launching and then disappearing, doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's been tricky, because sometimes hard decisions come up, especially when you're working with executives who have crazy schedules. Both our hosts and our guests coordinating it, we've had to decide at some points, like, okay, we're, somebody's away from their equipment, but do we still have the episode regardless? And we've just said quality is the most important thing, and establishing our reputation early on matters a lot to us. So we would rather have almost less episodes that are really high quality. I'd be interested to hear your take on that, because I know consistency is also huge.
Yeah, for me, I really think that setting consistency that you can hit is very important, and trying to get ahead. So you mentioned being booked out for a certain amount of time. I think you said till the end of the year. Balancing also not letting it get stale. That's like 3.5, 4 months, which is completely fine. So having episodes that are booked out, and then I'm a less is more type of person. So we care a lot about quality, and then repurposing more content out of each episode. So, staying consistent, create a calendar that you can continue to hit. For this show, it's weekly. For our other shows, it's bi-weekly. That's every other week. So, setting that out, and then creating a lot of repurposed content out of each episode, promoting that repurposed content in between episodes, not missing launch dates, things like that. So I think it's the same thing. Your audience knowing that a new episode is going to be there, and that it's going to be of high quality and have really good repurposed content that comes out of it each and every time. Yeah,
absolutely. I love the way you broke that down between, balancing those two.
Yeah.
So I guess the last piece with those KPIs and goals is just like what we're looking for the end of the year.
Yeah.
So I would like to double again. So we're averaging 440. We're about 6 weeks from launch now. We're averaging more like 515 listens per episode. So I would like to be seeing like upwards of 1,000 downloads per episode by the end of the year, which puts us, I would say, at a stage that's more mature than a podcast maybe that just launched, in its first 6 months, getting to that. But that's what I'm hoping for.
That's awesome. Over the next 12 to 18 months, what can we expect from Outreach's podcast efforts?
Yeah, well, I'm really excited because we've got, a lot of really exciting guests in the queue for all of our podcasts. But yeah, we're just hoping to make some even bigger and better improvements. Like we'd love to be getting, our full videos out on YouTube, not just, repurposed clips. And we have certain goals, like getting every single guest to promote their own episode. That's trickier than I would have expected it to be. I don't know if that's the same for you, but we just want everyone to be feeling the love around their episode. So we're working on like cool swag for revenue innovators so that people get really excited and guests just have the best experience possible. But I'm excited to see revenue innovators just become a very unique and differentiated podcast that's like different than all other business podcasts. I want people to listen to it and think, this is different. I've never heard something like this before. And I'm excited that my eyes are on it, and I'm getting to put more time toward it than most marketers probably get to with their podcast to actually, make it happen.
Awesome. Well, Sam, I think that's a good place to end since we're coming up on our time. Where can people go to find you, outreach, and the 3 podcasts that you work on?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a landing page for Revenue Innovators. It's saleshacker.com/revenue-innovators-podcast. That's kind of tricky, but you can also ask me for it on LinkedIn too. So I'm /in/Samantha Hembree if you want to connect on LinkedIn, and I can send anything your way about, the podcasts or what we're doing.
Awesome. Well, Sam, it was great having you today. I really appreciate you spending some time with us, and it was great having you on Recorded Content.
Thanks so much for having me.
All righty.